The scripture reading for today is parables. Luke chapter 15, verses 1 and 2 to begin, and then the parable of the prodigal son. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to him, and the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." And Jesus said, "There was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of property that falls to me.' And he divided his living between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took his journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in loose living. And when he had spent everything, a great famine arose in that country, and he began to be in want. So he went and joined himself to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into the fields to feed the swine. And he would gladly have fed on the pods that the swine ate, but no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants.' And he arose and came to his father. And while he was yet a distance, his father saw him and had compassion, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to the servants, 'Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and make merry. For as my son was dead and is alive again, he was lost and is found.' And they began to make merry. Now the elder son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called to one of the servants and asked what this meant. And he said to him, 'Your brother has come home, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he has received him safe and sound.' But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him. But he answered his father, 'Lo, these many years I have served you. I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me a kid that I might make merry with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has devoured your living with harlots, you killed for him the fatted calf.' And he said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to make merry and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found.' May God add his blessing to the reading of his word."
I love how Snoopy interpreted this parable. Why did they kill the fatted calf? Thanks. Luke's lead into the story of the prodigal son was why this was my dad's favorite story in the whole Bible. Because he was a father who had 2 sons. He loved to say, "One of my sons worked on the railroad, the other turned out to be a preacher. One son can take me anywhere for nothing. The other can make me good for nothing." Jesus' story has remained dynamic for centuries because it's so unfair. It rewards injustice. One thing, the bad boy's return home had nothing to do with love for his family. He only came back because he was hungry and broke. And the second thing is Dad forgave him before he could ever say he was sorry. He didn't ever get to say his speech. And the good son is the bad guy. Some folks think this story needs to be amended because not just because a young man was wasting his life, but because of such unreasonable love that we rarely see in this world. It's also a capsule of the world and the people in it. Both sons squandered their lives, only in different ways. One was in rowdy living, the other in rigid self-righteousness. Hard to say which one is worse. Surprisingly, the father takes the side of the sinner, not the righteous. You'd think it'd be the other way around. And not because he's better, but because he wanted to rebuild his relationship with his daddy. That's why. And reestablishing broken relationships is always more difficult than saving face. The sinner's the fave because there's something worse than sinning, according to this story. And that is having a son who doesn't know his father. Instead of dressing the bad boy down, he dresses him up. We had to celebrate, he said. We had to rejoice because this brother of yours was lost and he finally came to his senses. It's a typical Jesus story about when good things happen to bad people. I wrote a book about that, called it God's Surprising Goodness. And this was the basis, this story was the basis for that book. How we hear it depends upon where we stand and what we've done or what we've had done to us. Those who don't always get it right or did something we wish we hadn't done, broken solemn vows, betrayed sacred trust, hurt the people we love the most, are going to cotton to it. And it's understandable that some would prefer to stand on the outside and not go in and join the party and the celebration. It's understandable. Those who never broke any of the 10 Commandments, never left home, never neglected their responsibilities, people who can't stand to see somebody get away with anything and would rather sinners be wasted than converted, so they're going to prefer that this story be amended. You know the kind. Heaven's joy turns them sour. And an awful lot of people are still around who think of justice as payback, as long as they're the ones getting paid. If we can resist the temptation to make a hero out of the prodigal and a goat out of the elder brother, we're on good ground in this story. Because we need both as much as we need each other. One embodies, or each of them embodies half of what the gospel is about. But as long as they remain estranged, neither of them can live whole lives. They were lucky, though, to have a father who preferred reconciliation instead of separation. The younger son's situation is colored completely with grace. By dishonoring his dad, emptying his pockets, eating pig slop, he hits rock bottom, and that's when he comes to himself. Whatever it takes to get somebody to come to themselves because they've not been themselves, that's a good thing, even if it's bad. And he sees only two options for him. Either stay where he is and starve to death, or go back home and hope his daddy will take him in. And wisely, he decides to go back home. But the old man surprises him by embracing him, not scolding him. And Luke leaves no doubt as to what forgiveness looks like. Forgiveness is hard, man. He leaves no doubt about how much it costs. Forgiveness is costly. And this prodigal boy is entirely at his father's mercy. Will anybody tell him he's wrong? On the other hand, the elder brother lives strictly by the book. Luke describes his pained obedience as righteousness. If that seems to be stretching it a bit, at least we can say he was dedicated. He devoted his life to being the most right son he could be. He never left home. He never disobeyed. He never went against his daddy's wishes or blew his inheritance and wasted it in a far country. Never did any of that. He was a loyal, respectable, hard-working, straight shooter. All of those are good things. Will anybody tell him he's wrong? You'd think the father would, but he didn't. Didn't tell either one of them they were wrong. Isn't that great? He has nothing but love for both of his sons, and he was deeply moved by his younger son's remorse. Parents are always glad when their kids learn lessons, even if they're hard. And he sympathized with this older boy's dejection. He felt for him too. He said, "Son, you're always with me. What is mine is yours." He didn't get it. Just didn't get it. The man refused to choose between his sons. All his energy instead was focused on getting them back together again, because each one has something that the other needs. If the prodigal's going to survive, he could use a good dose of his big brother's dependability and integrity, could he not? And if the elder son's ever going to be somebody that others want to be around, he could stand some of his younger brother's joy and brokenness and guts, I guess you'd say. Could use some of that. Now, this is a story that has neither a hero or a scoundrel. Just two brothers who've grown up as mirror images of each other. All their lives they've defined themselves by their differences. Who am I? Well, I'll tell you what. I'm not like him. While this polarity has provided the family with a perverse kind of stability, Jesus stung his listeners when he said, "We had to celebrate and rejoice because your brother was lost and he's been found." Now, Jesus put the burden of the happy ending to this tale not on the boy who misbehaved. Did you catch that? He put it on the shoulders of the big brother. Nobody bothered to invite him to the party. He didn't even know anything about it. He had to ask a servant what was going on. What's all this music? there's no need for jealousy because the party is not about the prodigal. It's bigger than that. It's intended to be a family reunion. See, the only thing lacking was the big brother. But it's not fair, we say. So he won't be a party to it. If it was fair, it wouldn't be grace. And he stays outside because if he went inside, he'd have to choose. He'd have to choose between being right and being forgiving. Man, I can think of no harder choice. Jesus said, which is easier, to say, take up your bed and walk, or to forgive somebody? It's easier to take up your bed and walk. Forgiveness is very hard. If he went in, he'd have to choose between being right and being forgiven. Seems to me that the crime of this story is not somebody wasting their inheritance, although that's bad, but undeserved forgiveness. It starts off about a millennial's irresponsible behavior, but it ends with the father's unreasonable love. It's about how love always wins. Sometimes. Well, even love doesn't always win, does it? Sometimes having only two choices can paralyze you. Jesus offers another option. Why don't we redefine righteousness? Why don't we look at righteousness a different way and abandon the lower righteousness and amend it to being right but alone on the outside for the higher righteousness of embracing a wrongdoer? That's a new definition. And it's another choice. Not because it makes sense or serves justice or sends a message about facing the consequences, but because this is what God the Father is like. God is like this. Are you disappointed? How can somebody live so close to goodness and grace and not want to emulate it? The offended son never left home, but all the time he was there, he never understood his daddy's heart. Like King David, who was also one of God's Old Testament prodigals, but he was a man after God's heart. Something about David that God just loved. Because there is such a thing as attractive goodness and also repulsive goodness. There's a kind of goodness that you want to be a part of, be close to. And there's a kind of goodness that just repulses you. And both of them are in this story. The best goodness, I believe, is marked by winsomeness and tolerance and joy. When I misbehaved as a kid, and I did misbehave as a kid, my mom would do something I just detested. She would threaten me with my daddy. You know that, just wait till your daddy gets home, buddy. You're in for it. And man, I dreaded the homecoming. And I knew he'd be coming in after 4 o'clock. Sweating through every hour. Sweating for that 4 o'clock. Finally, I heard the back door slam. Sure enough, Mama runs to the kitchen and told Daddy whatever it was I did. Now, take him into the bedroom and give him a whipping. Today, that'd be called child abuse. But they didn't fool around down south in those old-timey days. But it didn't warp me to get a spanking. I don't know where that comes from, but I don't think I'm warped. Here we go in procession, like to electric chair or something. I felt like dead boy walking. And all the time, Daddy's unbuckling the belt. And when he shut the door, and the dread of what was going to happen had me wailing already before I even got a single lash. But was I in for a big surprise? My daddy was a fair-minded judge who didn't like to be made out to be the heavy, but he never touched me with that belt. Instead, this grand old guy winked and whispered, "Now you keep yelling while I whack this mattress." And baby, I did my part. And then I started giggling with tears streaming down my face at the same time, crying and laughing simultaneously. How do you do that? A father with a good heart can do that to you. You know? Kind of like our Heavenly Father. I bet Jesus just loved telling this story again and again, because it's a good one. To the prodigal's good fortune, he had a good daddy who turned out to be an understanding, forgiving, fun-loving guy who liked to party. Not a grudge-holding, payday someday, vengeful somebody. And as Luke tells it, the older brother never got it. Like so many today, so resentful of undeserved affirmation. Yeah, we're again it. Unless we happen to be the ones spared the belt.
The hymn is on page 107 of Amazing Grace.
May Christ go before you when you're lost, beside you when you're lonely, above you when you're down, and within you when you're perplexed. Amen.